The Southern Poverty Law Center is focused on 7 core issues of concern for marginalized people, and mainly people who live in the deep southern states of the United States. The core issues we were looking at on this stop of our virtual tour were economic justice and voting rights. The 3 main ways in which the Southern Poverty Law Center works towards economic justice for marginalized people is by focusing on the reforming of policies that trap the poor in a cycle of court debt, protecting safety nets for the poor, and protecting low-income consumers from predatory practices. Beginning in the 1990s with Reagan's tax cuts for the wealthy, the United States adopted a set of criminal justice strategies to address the fiscal gaps no longer filled by this country's wealthy citizens. In essence, this was accomplished by punishing poor people for their poverty. Right now, in America, 10 million people, representing 2/3 of all current and former offenders in the country, owe governments a total of $50 billion in accumulated fines and fees and other legally imposed costs by the current court system, which in most poor people's lives perpetuates the cycle of poverty in which they live. How is poverty criminalized? Not that hard, really. Imagine this. You get pulled over and ticketed for a busted headlight. The cost of the headlight ticket is $150 plus court fees, and that is more money than you have because your minimum wage job barely covers your basic living expenses. And so, either you accept the suspension of your license and you start driving illegally, because how else are you going to get to work? And if you get pulled over again without a license, you get more legal fees and possibly jail time, for which you need to post bail, which will probably send you to predatory lenders in order to pay those court fees and fines, trapping you as a poor person in a cycle of debt from which it is nearly impossible to escape, because the interest rates that so-called payday loans and auto title loans are legally allowed to charge makes repayment nearly impossible with today's minimum wage incomes. The Southern Poverty Law Center is helping to lead the charge to protect consumers from predatory lenders, while also working to educate the public and support a national effort to create strong consumer safeguards that will rein in this unsustainably voracious industry. Another issue related to poverty are the Panhandling Laws. Alabama has laws that criminalize begging, even though beggars lack stable housing or resources. These same poor people are denied access to social safety nets by politicians who stigmatize and blame homeless and low-income workers for our country's fiscal problems, when much of the responsibility actually has its origins in tax laws that benefit the wealthy. What is the Southern Poverty Law Center doing about all this? It has filed numerous cases in defense of homeless citizens. One example is Jonathan Singleton, 44, a resident of Montgomery, Alabama, experiencing homelessness. He was cited and or arrested 6 times for holding signs that conveyed messages such as homeless, today it is me, tomorrow it could be you. Jonathan struggles with chronic illness, including kidney failure and diabetes, which makes it difficult for him to maintain employment, housing, and health care. As a result, he has no other alternative but to rely on the help of people on the street for his survival. The lawsuit was filed on behalf of Jonathan and others who panhandle. Some welcome good news came in April of this year when it was announced that $22 million worth of funding was being provided to Alabama agencies for helping people who had lost their homes during the pandemic. And speaking of housing, if we want to understand the actual facts about why there are separate Black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods in America, because no, it didn't just happen that way. This highly regarded book by Richard Rothstein is essential reading for its research on the forgotten history of how our government officially segregated this country by designating which people with which skin color should and could legally live where. Here is a red-lined map of Los Angeles, and here are the red-lined maps for Brooklyn and the Bronx. And here's the red-lined map for Louisville, Kentucky. Taffany, our tour guide from the Southern Poverty Law Center, made some great recommendations about how we can learn more and get more active. One of her recommendations is the Poor People's Campaign, headed by Reverend William Barber. Check out their website. Lots going on all over the country, with a major emphasis on voting rights. Because after Georgia's voters turned out in record numbers for the 2020 presidential election and the U.S. Senate elections in early 2021, state legislators passed a sweeping and unconstitutional voting law that threatened to massively disenfranchise voters, particularly voters of color. The Southern Poverty Law Center and its allies filed a federal lawsuit against the state of Georgia and against Governor Brian Kemp. The lawsuit challenges multiple provisions of Georgia's law known as SB 202, including but not limited to a ban on line warming, where volunteers are providing water and snacks to people who are waiting in long lines to vote, because those long lines are far too common at precincts with large populations of voters of color. Severe restrictions on the use of mobile voting units. And drastic reduction of early voting in runoff elections. The law was debated and passed by both houses of the Georgia legislature and signed by Governor Brian Kemp, all in under 7 hours. The legislation was passed despite state officials praising the recent elections for their integrity, safety, and security. The lawsuit addresses how this new Georgia law violates voter protections under the 14th and 15th Amendments, as well as Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Most of us are familiar with Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's opinion about what the Supreme Court did to the Voting Rights Act when they didn't hold it up recently. She said, throwing out the Voting Rights Act when it has worked in a continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. Fortunately, Section 2 of the voting right is permanent and has no expiration date, as did other provisions of the Voting Rights Act. And so the fact that the lawsuit violates Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is quite significant and worth our hopeful attention as activists. The United States Department of Justice official government website informs us that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 prohibits voting practices or procedures that discriminate on the basis of race, color, or membership in one of the language minority groups identified in Section 4F2 of the Act. Most of the cases arising under Section 2 since its enactment involved challenges to at-large election schemes, but the section's prohibition against discrimination in voting applies nationwide to any voting standard, practice, or procedure that results in the denial or abridgment of the right of any citizen to vote on account of race, color, or membership in a language minority group. And of course, most importantly, Section 2 is permanent and has no expiration date, as do certain other provisions of the Voting Rights Act. The plaintiffs represented in the critically important case put forth by the Southern Poverty Law Center include organizations that understand how negatively their Get Out the Vote activities will be impacted by SB 202. Because these organizations represent Black voters, new citizens, religious communities, and people with limited English proficiency, including but not limited to the 6th District of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority, Georgia Muslim Voter Project, Women Watch Africa, Latino Community Fund Georgia, the ARC of the United States, Georgia ADAPT, Georgia Advocacy Office, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And so, let us conclude with words from Robert Kennedy. Few will have the greatness to bend history itself, but each of us can work to change a small portion of events, and in the total of these acts will be written the history of each generation. It is from numberless diverse acts of courage and belief that human history is shaped. Each time a man stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, these ripples build a current that can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. So, good thoughts for us to hold on to in these challenging times.